Mother's Day had always been one of those days I dreaded without fully realizing why, but this year it hit differently. As soon as I stepped into the living room, the air felt heavy with expectation I wasn't meant to meet. My parents were there, of course, smiling at everyone but me, as if I were invisible, and then it happened. My sister leaned over, loud enough for the whole room to hear, and said, "Honestly, you're so pointless. I don't even know why Mom bothers." Laughter followed, a mix of cruel amusement and casual neglect that cut deeper than any insult had before. I felt my cheeks burn, my throat tighten, and my stomach twist. Every past slight, every overlooked birthday, every dismissed accomplishment flashed in my mind. They had always favored others, always praised my cousins, my sister, everyone but me. Even my achievements seemed to vanish under their eyes. I sat frozen, a mix of shame, disbelief, and a quiet, simmering fury. For the first time in years, I recognized that this humiliation wasn't just an accident, it was a pattern. Every smile and word I had received from them now felt like a lie. And as I forced myself to stay seated, nodding politely to empty compliments from distant relatives, I realized something important. They didn't see me. They never had. And in that moment, a seed of resolve planted itself deep inside me, though I had no idea how far it would grow. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the silence swallow me whole. The laughter from the gathering still echoed in my ears, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I sank onto the couch, pulling my knees close and let my thoughts tumble uncontrollably. Every slight, every overlooked birthday, every time I stayed up late to help without thanks, every invisible sacrifice came rushing back. They had always underestimated me, dismissed me, treated me like I didn't matter, and today was just the latest reminder. I remembered Mom praising my sister for a project I had spent hours perfecting, Dad congratulating my cousin for something trivial, and me, standing in the background, unseen, unrecognized. My chest ached with a mixture of loneliness and simmering fury. How had I allowed this pattern to define me for so long? The unfairness weighed heavily, turning anger into determination. I could almost see the road ahead, foggy but undeniable. I couldn't let them continue to write the narrative of my life. They had decided who I was, but that stopped now. I closed my eyes and imagined a version of myself they couldn't ignore, a version built on my own terms, rising from their derision into something undeniable. The fire inside me sparked, mingling hurt with a newfound resolve, a promise that someday they would understand the mistake they had made. And as I sat alone in that quiet apartment, the full weight of their contempt settling around me, I realized that this pain, as unbearable as it was, would be the fuel I needed. Every snicker, every pointed comment, every dismissive glance had laid the foundation for the person I was about to become. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The embarrassment, the ridicule, and the cold dismissal from my family still lingered, but beneath it all, something had shifted. For the first time, I thought, I don't need their approval. That realization hit me like a jolt, shaking loose the chains of years spent seeking validation where none would ever come. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and began to plan. Not recklessly, not out of spite, but strategically. I started researching opportunities I had always ignored. Investments, business ventures, networking circles I'd thought were out of reach, skills I could master to elevate my career. Each idea ignited a spark inside me, a sense of possibility that was both intoxicating and terrifying. I imagined a life where my worth wasn't measured by their smiles or dismissive remarks, but by tangible success they couldn't ignore. I could see the subtle advantage of appearing calm, composed, almost indifferent, while quietly building momentum behind the scenes. A life they would eventually envy, a status they couldn't touch. I started drafting lists, setting small goals, envisioning milestones that would lead to power, respect, and a kind of luxurious independence I had only dreamed of. Every plan reinforced the notion that I was reclaiming my own narrative, and for the first time in memory, I felt that mix of fear and exhilaration, the delicious tension of knowing they had no idea what I was about to become. It was FOMO in reverse. They would soon realize what they'd underestimated, and the thought alone made my pulse quicken. This wasn't just ambition. It was survival. It was revenge. It was finally proving to myself that I could rise without their permission, and that realization made everything feel possible. I realized that dreaming wasn't enough. I had to act. The first step was identifying opportunities where I could gain real traction, career paths that paid respect and influence, investments that multiplied quietly, and strategic alliances that could open doors I hadn't dared approach before. I started attending local business meetups, shaking hands with people who smelled of ambition and possibility. "You have to think bigger," one mentor said, leaning forward over coffee, "and stop letting anyone else define your worth." His words hit me like a revelation. I could see the contrast clearly. Back then, at family gatherings, I had waited for approval that never came. Now I was commanding attention simply by showing up prepared. Every handshake, every brief conversation felt like a step away from the powerless kid I used to be. I negotiated small wins, a minor contract here, a project accepted there, and allowed myself to celebrate them quietly, knowing that these were the seeds of something bigger. At night, I'd sit in my apartment, reflecting on flashbacks of my past. Mom applauding my sister's minimal efforts, Dad's approving nods toward cousins while I lingered in silence. Now, I was learning the rules they had never bothered to teach me, carving a path that was entirely my own. I practiced conversations, honed pitches, and refined my personal presentation, knowing that status was partly perception. Each small victory stoked my confidence, each connection built momentum, and each memory of their past dismissal fueled the fire burning inside me. I was no longer invisible. I was becoming a force they would not recognize until it was too late. Weeks of meticulous effort finally bore fruit. I secured a promotion that I had only dreamed of months ago, one that came with responsibility, respect, and a salary that made a statement on its own. The exhilaration was immediate. I felt the weight of validation pressing into my chest, not from them, but from the world I had chosen to enter. My colleagues began to notice my competence, my ability to negotiate, to strategize, to handle situations with calm authority. Even the smallest acknowledgments, a compliment in a meeting, a nod from a senior executive, felt like fireworks compared to the years of silence from my family. I remembered that Mother's Day, their laughter still echoing in my mind, and I smiled quietly, savoring the contrast. Yet when I shared the news during a casual call home, the reaction was exactly what I expected. Dismissive laughter, a barely audible, "That's nice, I guess." Their inability to recognize my achievement only sharpened my resolve. This, I realized, was the first true power reversal. They had called me pointless, yet here I was, visibly progressing in a world they had always deemed beyond me. I didn't need their praise to know my worth, but seeing their reactions, or lack thereof, made the victory all the sweeter. I walked through the office the next day with a new posture, a quiet confidence radiating from every step, knowing that while they underestimated me, the world was taking notice. And in that silence, I felt an electric satisfaction. For the first time, I was living proof that pointless was their mistake, not my reality. With the first victory under my belt, I realized the next step wasn't just climbing professionally, it was transforming every visible aspect of my life. I began dressing intentionally, each outfit chosen to project competence, authority, and subtle wealth. My apartment received upgrades that were quiet but unmistakable, a new desk that signaled seriousness, decor that spoke of taste and ambition. I started attending more high-profile networking events, letting my presence become known, carefully balancing humility with quiet assertiveness. Each interaction reinforced my growing confidence. Colleagues sought my input, acquaintances began remembering my name, and I could feel a shift in how people treated me. The tension this created was intoxicating. Even as I maintained discretion, subtle hints reached my family. An acquaintance mentioned seeing me at a prominent event, or my LinkedIn updates appeared in their feed. I knew they noticed, yet they still underestimated the pace and magnitude of my transformation. The contrast between my past invisibility and my present emerging prominence thrilled me. I caught myself smiling at small victories, a knowing nod, a moment of recognition that my family would never expect. Internally, I relished this rising momentum, understanding that true power wasn't just wealth or status, but the ability to move through spaces they had always assumed were off-limits. With every day, every calculated decision, every subtle display of confidence, I built not just influence, but a persona that demanded attention. And as the walls of my past limitations crumbled, I could feel the first real stirrings of fear and curiosity from them, a tension that promised even greater satisfaction when the moment of reckoning finally arrived. By now, I understood that real power wasn't just about small victories or public recognition. It was about control, perception, and timing. I began orchestrating my next moves in secret, each decision layered with intention. I purchased property discreetly, selecting locations that symbolized security and upward mobility, yet kept my acquisitions under the radar. Investments followed, calculated and measured, each one compounding into a growing reservoir of wealth that no one in my family could have anticipated. I sought alliances carefully, cultivating relationships with people who held influence, all while keeping my progress hidden behind the ordinary facade of daily life. Nights were spent reviewing spreadsheets, refining strategies, and visualizing the moment when everything would culminate into the reveal I had long imagined. The thrill came from knowing that while I was quietly constructing my empire, they remained blissfully unaware, still seeing me as the same pointless figure from that humiliating Mother's Day. Every covert step, every calculated risk heightened my anticipation. I imagined the looks on their faces when the veil finally lifted. The shock, the disbelief, the realization that the person they dismissed had become untouchable. The suspense I built for myself was addictive. Each day passed with both patience and eagerness, knowing that the perfect moment to assert my transformation was approaching. And as I closed my laptop that evening, the thought lingered. They had no idea what I was about to unleash, and that ignorance was my greatest advantage, my secret weapon waiting for its inevitable moment of exposure. I sat across from my closest friend, the one person who had seen me struggle and never judged, and let the weight of my thoughts spill out. I don't want to just prove them wrong, I confessed, my voice low. I want them to feel the consequences of everything they've done. But I'm scared of what that might make me. My friend leaned in, eyes steady, and said, "There's a difference between taking control of your life and letting anger define you. You can win without losing yourself." I nodded, knowing they were right, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. The desire for justice coursed through me, a powerful mix of vindication and vindictive anticipation, yet beneath it lingered the fear of crossing a line I couldn't come back from. I thought about the years of neglect, the endless dismissals, the quiet humiliation that had shaped my every choice. Could I allow myself to enjoy this revenge without it corroding my sense of who I was? I recalled late nights planning, researching, building, always careful to balance ambition with integrity. Yet even now, the moral stakes loomed large. I imagined the moment I would finally reveal the extent of my transformation, the satisfaction, the shock. But I also imagined losing empathy, becoming someone I wouldn't recognize in the reflection. The conflict raged inside me, the pull of justice against the pull of self-preservation, each thought slicing through the other. And yet, despite the fear, a stubborn resolve settled in my chest. I could be strategic, measured, and still claim my life, my worth, and the respect they had denied me. The question wasn't whether I would act. It was whether I could act without losing myself entirely. And in that tension, I found both fear and purpose. The moment had finally come. I drafted a post, carefully curated, each detail chosen to showcase my transformation without a hint of desperation. A photo of my new office, sleek and commanding. A glimpse of my recent investment milestone. A caption that spoke of growth, independence, and ambition. I hit post and felt a surge of exhilaration mixed with nerves. Within hours, notifications began flooding in. But it wasn't the likes or comments that thrilled me. It was the subtle ripple through my family. My phone buzzed with messages from distant relatives forwarding the post, and I could almost hear my parents' disbelief in their silence. The comments were a mix of admiration and envy, and I relished the tiny pang of FOMO I knew was now creeping into their minds. They had always underestimated me, treated me as if my existence was inconsequential, and now the truth was undeniable. I had built a life of success they hadn't even imagined. Every like, every share, every whispered mention in their circles fed the tension I had been cultivating for months. It was the first major, look at me now moment. No words needed, no confrontation required. The contrast between who I had been and who I was now was stark, electric, and utterly satisfying. I felt a thrill in knowing that while they were processing the reality of my success, I was still calm, composed, and fully in control. This was only the beginning, but already, the scales had started to tip in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their ignorance had been my advantage, and now, as the first signs of shock appeared in their expressions and messages, I knew the game had changed entirely. They tried to laugh it off, the way people do when the truth is too uncomfortable to meet. At the next family gathering, my sister made a show of scanning her phone and scoffing, "Oh, she posted another one. Cute." Dad offered a polite smile that barely hid his confusion, and Mom shifted uncomfortably, the seam of her composure fraying. They assumed their jibes and dismissive tone could shield them from embarrassment forever. That arrogance became my ally. I had been patient by design, letting their ignorance grow like a thick skin around them. I had cultivated relationships with people who mattered in ways they couldn't imagine. A banker who respected discretion, a lawyer who admired precision, a journalist acquaintance who loved a good human reversal story. I didn't need to shout about my success. I needed to place it where it would be felt, not just seen. The plan was surgical. I bought into a small but strategic stake in the company my uncle prided himself on, the same business he'd bragged about at weddings and birthday parties for years. He had always believed that the company was his legacy, immune to outsiders and impervious to challenge. I used that belief against him. Working quietly through intermediaries, I built alliances within the board, offered capital paired with a vision for expansion, and positioned myself as an indispensable partner. The months of careful introductions, late-night analyses, and financial patience converged into a set of documents that said more than any speech ever could. When I finally made the move public, I did it with the kind of calm that infuriates. I sent a corporate announcement to the industry press and a polite, factual note to the family group chat. "Pleased to share I've joined the board as a strategic investor," it read. No flourish, no taunt. The message landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples were immediate. My uncle's face went white when he read it. He tried to laugh, the same practiced chuckle he'd used to dismiss me at family events, but it sounded hollow. "There's been a mistake," he stammered, voice cracking when my aunt demanded specifics. He called his lawyer, his partners, anyone who could reaffirm the narrative he'd relied on his whole life. But the documents were real, the meetings documented, the signatures undeniable. The board had seen the strategy, the potential, and the value in what I brought. They had welcomed my input. The cold logic of business made the personal sting visible. This was competence, audited and recorded, not a rumor that could be laughed away. They attempted a public smear, as if a desperate insult could undo the facts. My cousin posted an accusatory message claiming I had manipulated documents, an absurd claim easily disproved by the audit trail. I let their desperation flail. It made them look small and panicked. Meanwhile, industry publications picked up the story. The quiet outsider who had quietly become essential. The narrative shifted from family gossip to business news, and with it came a new kind of validation, one that couldn't be dismissed with a scoff at a dinner table. There was also a symbolic reversal I had prepared. At the same time as the corporate announcement, I arranged for a charitable donation in my mother's name to the community center she had always talked about supporting but never funded. It was a gentle pivot, a way to expose hypocrisy without theatrics. The center released a public thank you, noting that the donation came from an anonymous supporter before the family realized the connection. When my mother learned the truth, she tried to spin gratitude into affection, to claim the gesture as inspiration that she had always intended to follow through. The narrative she wanted, of herself as the benevolent matriarch, fractured under the weight of what had actually happened. Watching their attempts to regain control was instructive. I felt a surge of vindication when my uncle's allies began to call me for meetings, asking for insight and partnership. The same relatives who had mocked my pointless existence now called to congratulate me. their voices strained with an uneasy mixture of pride and belated respect. Some offered apologies laced with excuses. Others kept their distance, nursing wounded pride. Either way, the balance had shifted. What surprised me most, however, wasn't the public fall from grace they briefly experienced. It was how quickly they tried to rebuild their narrative around me. People are adept at spinning comfort when faced with discomfort, rather than admit fault. They rewrote history to include me as a sudden, inexplicable success. The truth, though, had already been published, audited, and stamped. The power reversal was complete. Those who had dismissed me were now forced to acknowledge my competence, not as a charity, but as a business reality that demanded respect. Even in victory, I felt a muted sensation, an awareness that punishment had never been the point. I wanted recognition, not humiliation. I wanted to be seen. And in that moment, as offers for board positions and speaking engagements began to arrive, I understood what I'd truly taken, not their approval, but my own authority to define myself. By the time the family calls subsided into awkward voicemails and tentative text messages, I had moved on to the next phase of my plan. There were still public faces to manage, investments to grow, and boundaries to build. Their shock had been effective, surgical, and necessary, but it was not the end. The revelation had done its work, exposing their assumptions and correcting the record. As I closed my laptop that night, the image of my mother at the community center dedication, smiling through a cloud of conflicted pride and disbelief, I realized the final lesson. Power without compassion felt hollow, and the work ahead would be to hold both strength and softness as I rebuilt my life on my terms every day. The messages began almost immediately. Texts, emails, even hesitant calls from relatives who had never paid attention before. I could sense their shock, the tremor of disbelief as they processed what had happened. My uncle's voice cracked when he tried to speak on the phone, struggling to reconcile the confident, powerful person I had become with the pointless figure he had dismissed for so long. My parents were silent at first, each conversation stilted, filled with pauses heavy with regret they didn't know how to voice. My sister, the one who had sneered at me on Mother's Day, kept her responses brief, defensive, betraying a mix of envy and admiration she couldn't admit aloud. I listened quietly, letting their reactions wash over me. A complex cocktail of satisfaction, relief, and an unexpected tenderness toward myself. The validation I had craved, denied for so many years, finally arrived, but it was not without cost. As I reflected on every late night, every strategic move, every calculated risk that had brought me here, a part of me recognized the emotional toll it had taken. I had grown powerful, yes, but the journey had demanded a meticulous control of anger and ambition, a restraint that sometimes felt unnatural. There was a bittersweet ache beneath my triumph. Joy at their recognition, tempered by the lonely realization that my life's transformation had been largely solitary. Yet even with that quiet melancholy, I felt an undeniable sense of self-worth, a clarity that my achievements were mine alone, built from resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to be invisible any longer. The family's shock had served its purpose, but what lingered in me was more than vindication. It was the steady, unshakable knowledge that I had defined my own value, that my power and success could never again be denied, not by them, nor by anyone else. Sitting in my penthouse apartment, I allowed myself a quiet moment to take it all in. The skyline glowing in the distance, the hum of the city beneath me, the life I had meticulously built piece by piece. Every decision, every calculated move, every sleepless night had led to this point. I no longer needed anyone's approval to define my worth. The validation I had chased from my family had transformed into something far more enduring. Self-respect, competence, and independence. The humiliating echoes of that Mother's Day still lingered in my mind, but they no longer held power over me. I could recall my sister's smirk, my uncle's dismissive comments, and the cold laughter from my parents, and instead of pain, I felt perspective. Those moments had fueled the fire that carried me here. They had been the catalyst, not the anchor. I dressed for myself now, moved through my life deliberately, and cultivated relationships that enriched me rather than diminished me. Luxury was no longer a trophy to impress them. but a reflection of my persistence, intelligence, and resilience. I smiled as I reflected on the contrast, the overlooked, underestimated version of me sitting quietly at family gatherings, versus the confident, empowered person who could now navigate rooms, boards, and opportunities with authority. I understood that real power came not from public recognition or vindication, but from the knowledge that I could rise without their permission and thrive despite their disbelief. As I poured myself a glass of wine, I whispered to no one in particular, "You called me pointless, and look at me now." It wasn't vengeance. It was liberation. The weight of their judgment no longer defined my steps, my decisions, or my vision. That Mother's Day, once a symbol of rejection and shame, had become the reference point for everything I had accomplished. I had taken the humiliation, transformed it into strategy and drive, and emerged not only victorious in status and wealth, but in self-possession. I realized finally that empowerment wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was enough, that my value had never depended on them, and that the life I built would always reflect the strength I had discovered within.